Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, let's just get right into this. I got a lot I want to go through today. So, we are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the network operating and the broadcasts coming. So, if you enjoy the shows, the information, the discussions, the topics, the other hosts and guests on the shows, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website and get signed up as a monthly subscribing member. Even if it's as little as $10, $20 a month, every membership counts, and we do need your support to keep the network operating and the shows coming. So, if you want to maintain one of the best sources you have to information on freedom and, of course, the problems with our tax system, we sure would appreciate it if you'd get signed up as a subscribing member. And if you want to get fully informed on the maladministration of our tax system and actually the fraudulent and unconstitutional nature behind it, you need to find your way over to tax-freedom.com and start reading, because I've got all the information posted there. And if you wanted your own copy, you could work your way over to irszoom.com and pick yourself up a copy of The Simple Truth About Income Tax V 2.0. It's only $6 there, and it's a 100-page PDF download that explains everything about the original legislation and subject matter jurisdiction in the courts, which I'm going to talk about today, and how to deal with the tax with your employer, because, of course, the solution to the income tax is for everyone to claim exempt on their W-4 and stop filing. If they don't withhold any money from you, you don't need to file to get a refund, and that's the only legal reason to file. There's no requirement to file to pay tax. It's an indirect tax. It is collected at the source from parties subject to it or from parties that allow its collection without knowing they're not subject to the tax, which we're going to talk about a bit today. So that's tax-freedom.com to get educated. The Simple Truth About Income Tax at irszoom.com to get the copy of the information that you can show to others with the exhibits. And if you really want to get the whole compendium, you should pick up the American Tax Bible, which is on sale for just $50 now at the irszoom.com store. And it's an 800-page PDF download that is a compendium of most of my work across the last 30 years. That includes articles about the tax, the problems, templates to use for legal pleadings in tax court, in court, to answer IRS correspondence, initial correspondence, liens and levies. So it's a compendium of material that educates you on the application of the tax law. And of course, it's the education you haven't given, and which even the attorneys and the accountants are kept ignorant of, because everyone has been persisting in insisting that the tax is a direct tax under the 16th Amendment on everything you do, on all income. And income means earnings, redefined as profit, of course, because that's what it is. It's not a tax on profit, it's a tax on earnings. Only the corporations get to reduce it to a tax on profit, because they get to deduct everything they do as an expense. Their rent, their car, their gas, their food, everything is deducted. But if you try to deduct your rent, your gas, your car, your bills, your heating, your electricity, your phone bill, oh no, those aren't expenses that are related to your earning money. They're only expenses that are related to earning money when a corporation earns them. Those aren't expenses that you're entitled to deduct. So the corporation pays tax on profit, and the individual pays tax on earnings. And that, of course, is a slave system, because it's not really tax at all, as I've explained before. The tax isn't being deposited into the Treasury as required by law under Title 26, Section 7809. It's being routed around the Treasury to the private corporate Federal Reserve Bank, because it's not a tax system, it's a peonage debt service system. The labors of the American people are being used collectively to collateralize the $36 trillion owed to the Federal Reserve Bank. And the method of collateralization is a certain percentage of your wages and salaries are deducted from your paycheck and sent not to the Treasury as tax, which is what the law requires if it is tax. They're sent around the Treasury to the Federal Reserve Bank so that a consistent flow of dollars arrives at the Federal Reserve Bank, collateralizing the $36 trillion and convincing them that they should continue to loan more money to Congress. And of course, the consequences of this system is that when in September or October, when a hurricane hits Louisiana, an earthquake hits California, Congress runs down to the Treasury to draw on the tax revenues that have been accumulating there all year long from the employers sending in the withheld taxes of their employees. And when Congress gets there, what do they find? Oh, surprise! There's no money there. There's no accumulation of tax revenues. There's no money there. It's all been routed around the Treasury to the Federal Reserve Bank, and Congress can't appropriate funds from the Federal Reserve Bank, but they still have to come up with the $5 billion for FEMA to help California and Louisiana in the natural disasters. What are they going to do? What are they going to do? Oh, that's right. They just run down to the Federal Reserve Bank and borrow another trillion, 37 trillion, 38, 39, 40. And there's no money in the Treasury because it's not a system of taxation. It's been a fraudulent system of alleged taxation, i.e., as a direct tax on all earnings under authority of the 16th Amendment. And this is a complete and total fraud. What it amounts to in reality, in truth, is there has been an insurrection of rebellious sedition that has been occurring, not on January 6th, but for the last 60 years in the federal courts. In the federal courts. It's the federal circuit courts that have invented the false claim that the income tax is a non-apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment. And it's been tested many times. It's a non-apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment. It's a direct tax. It's a direct tax. It's a direct tax. Why does it have to be a direct tax? Why were they so insistent on that when it was obvious it wasn't a direct tax? And now, of course, in Moore et al., the Supreme Court has said income taxes are indirect taxes. That means every single piece of legal enforcement action in the federal courts, both civil and criminal, for the last 60 years has been a constitutional fraud. A constitutional fraud. They've been enforcing a direct tax under the 16th Amendment that doesn't exist because the income tax is an indirect tax under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. What the 16th Amendment does is it prevents the judges from ruling that a tax is direct because of the source taxed. And once you remove the source argument, you can dupe the people into believing their rent is taxable, their interest is taxable, their dividends are taxable. None of those things are taxable. When earned by an individual citizen, they're only taxable to the corporate person, the non-resident alien under 1441B, and of course, they were taxable to citizens living and working in Canada between 1918 and 1993, which is the original legislation that Section 61 was enacted under. A Canadian tax treaty that expired in 1993. Section 61 is technically dead-letter law. The original legislation expired without Congress ever reenacting the statute with a greater applicability at law than it had under the original legislation it was enacted under. And when the original legislation timed out and expired, which most laws don't, But this particular piece of legislation did. It was a tax treaty with Canada that lasted for 75 years. When the tax treaty expired, so too did all laws written, created, authored under the legislation, like Section 61, which had not been reenacted, which Section 61 was not reenacted by Congress with any greater applicability than it had in its original legislation. And this is all reflected in the published law through 1993 when it expired. So Section 61 never had any domestic application to citizens, and they got away with alleging that your sources of income were taxable because the 16th Amendment removed the source limitation. But it didn't enable Congress to write law to enforce anything about sources that would affect the people, because there's no enabling enforcement clause to authorize Congress to write new law. This is part of the reason why the Supreme Court ruled that no new powers are authorized and no new subjects are taxed by the creation of the amendment. It simply permanently classifies the income tax as an indirect tax, part of the powers to tax by impost, duty, and excise. And the question then becomes, well, what part? Is it a new power to tax indirectly, a fourth power, income, separately from impost, duty, and excise? And the court said, no new powers are created, so no, it can't be a new power. Is either a direct power without limitations, which is what they've been doing, nor can it be a new power as a fourth category of indirect taxation. So what role does it play if no new powers are created? Well, what the Supreme Court said is the role that income plays is it's not the object of the tax. It's not the subject of taxation, as it has been misrepresented since World War II. Income is the yardstick that measures the amount of tax owed on the earnings derived from the federally taxable activity, i.e., some transaction, event, or activity subject to an impost, duty, and excise. And all the earnings derived from the impost, duty, and excise taxable activity, the tax owed on them is measured by income, profit, earnings minus deductions. But impost only taxes foreign persons, foreign imports, and foreign activity, and in foreign places. And we see that in the 1939 law, showing us, well, the income tax law was published in 1939 under the statutes of law. 26 years after it was enacted in 1913, the 1939 law clearly shows the tax applies to non-resident aliens, foreign corporations, and in territories and possessions of the United States. Why? Because it was enacted as the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913, and a tariff is one form of an impost which taxes foreign activity. So income, again, is not the object or the subject. It's the yardstick. It's the mechanism by which the amount of tax owed is measured. But you only measure tax on earnings derived from impost, duty, or excise. Again, impost is foreign, duty is exported goods. Duty is taxes on goods being exported out of the country, leaving the country for resale or consumption in foreign markets. And we have duty-free shops at the international airports. If you're leaving the country, you can buy American merchandise, goods, and liquor free of all taxes and take them to the other country to resell or consume. But we have basically foregone duties in America because we don't have any natural resource shortages or material goods shortages that would compel Congress to write law that would tax the export of either the resource or the goods. We reward our companies for selling into overseas markets. We don't punish them. Excise, of course, taxes alcohol, the manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities, licenses to pursue certain occupations, and the corporate privilege. So where's the tax on your right to work, your labor, your salaries, your wages, your compensation, your interest, your rent, your royalties, your dividends, your annuities, your pensions? Where is any of that taxable? How is any of that a federal activity? We'll be back in 5. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and we're just going to go ahead and get right back into this. As we came up on the commercial break, I was explaining that the powers to tax indirectly by Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, enforced by written law through an authorized Congress under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, which is the original necessary and proper enabling enforcement clause that authorizes Congress to write law to enforce the powers granted by the articles, the original articles of the Constitution. That clause does not grant Congress authority to write law under any amendment. Each amendment, where it is intended for new law to be authorized to be written by Congress, each amendment has its own enabling enforcement clause. The 13th, the 14th, the 15th, they all have their own enabling enforcement clauses to enable the prosecution of the involuntary servitude, the slavery, the discrimination, the denial of access to vote. Those all have enabling enforcement clauses. It's necessary for the clause to be there for a new power to be created. It's not in the 16th Amendment. It's part of the reason why the Supreme Court ruled no new powers are created, no new subjects are created, because without an authority to write law in the form of an enabling enforcement clause in the 16th Amendment, you couldn't have any new powers or create new subjects because there's no law that can be written. So, when you take away an alleged power to tax directly and without limitation, you're left with only the powers to tax by impost, duty, and excise. Impost is foreign and can't reach activities in the 50 states, which are domestic, not foreign. Duties tax exported goods and couldn't possibly reach activities conducted by right, like your right to work, labor, salaries, and wages. Couldn't possibly reach that in the 50 states, and that leaves only the excise taxing power, which was defined in 1911 in Flint v. Stone Tracy, 220 U.S. 107, 1911. Been cited over 600 times since then. It's now constitutional law as to the scope and range of legal effect and power of the excise taxing power. And in Flint v. Stone Tracy, the court ruled that the power to tax by excise is the power to tax the manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities within the country, to tax licenses to pursue certain occupations, and to tax the corporate privilege, where it is the privilege that is the subject of the tax, not the mere earning of money. So everything the corporation does is inherently taxable because the corporation earns that money, all of it, from all sources through its privilege of incorporation, and that makes everything it does inherently taxable to the government because it is an inherently taxable person. Same thing with the non-resident alien who was addressed in the original Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act, the original income tax legislation in 1913. All of his sources are taxable, but not the citizen. That's why the tax wasn't collected from Americans from 1913 to 1945 or 1942, if you want to count the victory tax, because it wasn't imposed on you. It wasn't until they got to the victory tax that there actually was a tax imposed on you. But that only lasted for 2 years. It was a temporary war revenue measure, and when it expired, they decided they couldn't let the power go. They'd paid off 90% of the war debt in 2 years, and nobody complained. Everybody bought into the patriotic duty to sacrifice to help defeat the Nazis in the European theater and the Imperial Japanese in the Pacific. And they did. And when the victory tax expired, they passed the Subtitle C employment tax laws that put in place taxes for Social Security, and unemployment tax eventually was added there, but they didn't impose a new income tax. They just set up a system under Chapter 24 of Subtitle C where the collection of the tax at the source is effected through withholding, which is controlled by the employee's allowance certificate, where the employee asks the employer to deduct tax from his pay at a certain rate. by claiming either single and zero or married with 2, 3, 4, however many deductions you claim. That automatically triggers a rate of withholding and turns into withholding from your pay, which turns into a mythical belief that you're subject to the tax and you owe it, and that you should file a return after allowing the withholding of tax that isn't imposed on you and doesn't reach you and for which you're not liable. So all of this came out of habitual practice during and after World War II, not through any change of law. And then, in order to justify what was being done, because as I've explained, impost, duty, and excise don't reach the labors of the American people with legal effect as a tax. The government has admitted as such. The only possible way to argue that your labor might be taxed by impost, duty, or excise indirectly is to argue that labor is a commodity, and that as such, excise taxes tax the manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities. So when you work, you're producing the commodity of labor, and therefore it's subject to excise taxation. Now, that doesn't exist in the law, but this is a theoretical application that could be argued, theoretically. However, the labor unions saw them coming. In the 1930s, when they started putting Social Security in place, the labor unions said, oh my goodness, look at this. They're going to try and tax the labors of the American people. And you know where I'll bet they're going to start? Is with the labor unions. So labor union management gathered up all their money, went and lobbied Congress and have them write Title 15, Section 17. Title 15, Section 17 says, the labor of a human being is not a commodity or article of commerce. Whoops! There goes your taxation by excise. That law removes labor from subjectivity to taxation by excise as a commodity. It can't be done. So, if there is no power to tax the earnings of the American people by impost, duty, and excise, how do you get them to buy into the tax? Well, that's easy. You lie to them for 75 years and tell them they're subject to a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. And when they say direct taxes have to be apportioned, you point out the 16th Amendment says the income tax is a tax without apportionment. Yeah, but it doesn't say it's direct. It just says it's without apportionment. Indirect taxes don't have to be apportioned. They only have to be uniform. So that means nothing, since the word direct isn't there. And when you assume the word direct, you come to a new power that's unlimited, that allows them to tax your earnings, your salary, your wages, your interest, your rent, your royalties, your dividends, your annuities, your income from life insurance and endowment contracts, your pensions, your income from discharge of indebtedness, your distributive share of partnership gross income, your compensation for services. All the things there in Section 61 suddenly all magically become taxable as sources of earnings that under the 16th Amendment can be taxed directly. So the American people all become slaves, or rather are made peons, compelled to service the debts of their master owed to the ruler, the Federal Reserve Bank, who's actually the party running everything, pulling the strings. So the government has been lying to the American people for 75 years that the tax is a direct tax without limitation. And that's been the basis for getting 61 to apply to you. Actually, that's not quite the basis, because if you look at Section 61 and compare it to Section 1441B, 1441B is the original list of taxable source items when earned by a non-resident alien. It's from the law in 1913, and it lists all the same things that are in Section 61. It just lists them in a continuous paragraph instead of a bulleted list. But that was the original list, and Section 61 was copied from that 1441B when it was implemented in 1918 as Section 22A under the 75-year-long Canadian Tax Treaty. And it's actually interesting, when you look at 22A, salaries, wages, and compensation, all three terms are there in 22A, just like all three terms are there in 1441B when earned by a non-resident alien. So 22A taxed the salaries and wages of citizens in Canada. But in 1954, they recodified the law and they moved Section 22A to Section 61. And when they did, they removed the words salaries and wages from the statute. There was no change in the law by Congress. Somebody just decided to remove salaries and wages from the statute. And I'm pretty sure the reason why they removed salaries and wages is because they intended, after World War II, to start using Section 61 as the statutory basis to deceive the people about their earnings from all these sources being subject to tax. And if they had left salaries and wages in the statute, that would have been patently unconstitutional. The taxation of the labor of the American people. So they removed salaries and wages so they wouldn't have a patently unconstitutional statute on its face. And they left compensation there. Now you can argue, well, how is compensation different from salaries and wages? Well, here, I'll tell you. Can a corporation earn salaries and or wages? No, it can't. Only individuals can earn salaries or wages. Can a corporation earn compensation? Of course it can. So was the intent in removing salaries and wages to only tax the corporate person to whom all earnings are taxable and Section 61 would apply as a list of sources that the corporations had to pay on? Because all of it is earned through the corporate privilege as a corporation, and therefore rent, interest, dividends, royalties, annuities, income, pensions, all of it is taxable, although I'll admit pensions aren't going to get paid to a corporation. But how is a pension a federally taxable activity? Is it subject to an impost, a duty, an excise? No, it would only be subject to a direct tax, which can only be alleged to potentially, possibly exist under the 16th Amendment, which is exactly what they've alleged for 75 years. And now the Supreme Court says in Moore, income taxes are indirect taxes. They're not direct. Well, what happens when you lose the direct foundation? What happens when you lose the direct foundation is you're limited to impost, duty, and excise, which don't reach the labor of American people with legal effect. The income tax is gone if it's an indirect tax. It only exists in the territories and the possessions under the tax treaties that are left with Europe because the Canadian treaty expired and we have none with Mexico. And as a corporate tax, or a tax on ATF and ATF licenses, petroleum fuels licenses to transport fuels across interstate lines. Commodities and articles of commerce. That's it. There is no federal basis for an income tax to apply to the labor of the American people, where the labors are earned from the citizens' simple exercise of their right to work and an occupation at common law of their choosing exclusively within the territories and lands of the single state they live in. There's no federal territorial jurisdiction. There's no federal legislative jurisdiction or prerogative. It's all strictly state, exclusively state over their lands, their contracts, their agreements, their work, their labor. Federal government's got nothing to say about it. Nowhere in the Constitution is it authorized. And the only way to allege it is to lie about the 16th Amendment, which the Supreme Court has now exposed as being a lie. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network, and I'm just going to get right back into this. When we came up on the commercial break, I was talking about Section 61 and how after World War II in 1954 it was recodified from Section 22A to Section 61, at which point the terms salaries and wages were removed from the code section without legislative change by Congress, just from moving it from 22A to 61. It had words removed. That's not supposed to happen. And the footnote in the U.S. Code annotated on 61 says that it was inherited out of Section 22A substantially unchanged. But I'd say removing salaries and wages is a pretty substantial change. So Section 61 doesn't have the words salaries and wages in it. And when you compare it to 1441B, where you see that compensation, salaries, and wages are three distinct separate terms, sources for taxable earnings to the non-resident alien, and when you see that all three terms were there originally in Section 22A, you have to wonder who authorized removing them from Section 61 and why were they removed. And as I said in the show earlier, I think they were removed so that you wouldn't have a patently unconstitutional statute trying to tax the labors of the American people so blatantly, even though Section 61 didn't have any application to domestic income. It was still limited to the tax treaty. We're now 35 years into the treaty, and nobody knows. Nobody knows it's just treaty legislation. If the government comes into court and tells some pro se Section 61 says you owe tax on all this, the poor sucker doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to research the fact that Section 61 isn't 61, it's 22A and a 39 code, and that came out of 1918 legislation. Well, that's not when the income tax was enacted. What was 1918? Oh, 75-year-long Canadian tax treaty. Well, I'm not in Canada. Section 61 doesn't apply. So they intended to use Section 61 to dupe the American people. They selectively enforced the tax against individuals who were not able to defend themselves, didn't have attorneys. And gradually they began to build this body of opinions in the lower courts that started to replace the constitutional authority originally proclaimed by the courts in Bershaber, which said it's an indirect tax. We reject the argument it's a direct tax. There are no new powers created and no new subjects. So, and in the very next case, Stanton v. Baltic Mining, they said it's inherently indirect, again reaffirming what they had just decided in Bershaber with respect to the corporate aspect of the tax that was tested in Stanton v. Baltic Mining. So, you have it's fraudulently being applied as a direct tax using Section 61, and you say, oh, well, if they took salaries and wages out of Section 61, how come they still point to that code section to tax them now? And that's a great question. Thanks very much for asking it. The answer to that is judicial legislation. The crime of judicial legislation. A judge rewrote the statute with his opinion. Oh, looky here. Compensation for services. It's right there. Salaries and wages are compensation for services. So now you're a slave. But look, salaries, wages, and compensation are three separate, distinct terms in 1441B. Why are two of them missing in Section 61? I don't have to explain to you. I've ruled. You're taxed. Sit down, go home, and be a slave. And don't come back or I'll fine you $25,000. Judicial legislation is how they put salaries and wages back into Section 61. A judge made it up. A judge made it up. And then another judge said, oh, look, he made it up, so I'll do the same thing too. And then another judge, and another judge, and another judge. And pretty soon you have every judge in the country, what, with blonde hair? No, enforcing communism. The second plank of the Communist Manifesto, a direct income tax that's graduated, break the people into classes and tax them at different rates and keep them at war with one another. So that both sides of the class conflict are constantly calling out to the government to exercise more power, step in and end the conflict you engineered with your class legislation. It's all unconstitutional. Graduated tax brackets can't be applied to the American people because it's not uniform treatment of the American people. They can be applied to the corporate person, the foreign person, the licensed person, the inanimate commodities and articles of commerce subject to tax, but they cannot be applied to the American people. It's class legislation. This is all written up in one of the affirming opinions in the Pollock v. Loan. There's the opinion of the court, and then there's concurrence. In one of the concurrence opinions, it's all laid out how this is class legislation and should have been knocked down on that basis, not the source argument, which was correct, of course, because the source argument's nonsense. Source argument is nonsense. It was never a tax on property. It was rent streaming from property that was being leased by a farmer to grow crops on the land. That's the use of the commodity of land. That's taxable by excise. It's also taxable by excise because it was earned by a company, which is subject to tax on everything. The property had nothing to do with it. It was a third-party tenant. So Pollock v. Farmers Loan was all nonsense about the source argument. And that's what caused the 16th Amendment and opened the door to them misusing it and lying to the American people, using constitutional fraud since the end of World War II and judicial legislation to bring the direct and unlimited power to tax income authorized under the 16th Amendment, to bring it to bear on your fruits of labor derived from your simple exercise of the right to work, where rights aren't federally taxable events, activities, transactions. And you are not an inherently federally taxable person the way the corporation is, the way the corporate person is, the way the foreign person is, the way the licensed person is. As a citizen, you don't fall into those categories of persons with diminished rights who are inherently taxable on everything they do. And by making everyone a person, they've bamboozled you into accepting treatment as though you were that corporate person to whom everything you earn is taxable. But it's not. This, of course, is the basis for people arguing the capital letters make you... No, the capital don't make you a corporation. It is true that you're being treated as though you were one, but that's not the argument. Their argument is it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. It's not that you're a corporate person. It's a argument is the error is it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. And of course, if it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment, there's nothing you can do about it. You owe it. They can take 100% and turn us all into slaves, which is part of the reason why the Supreme Court rejected the argument that it's a direct tax. But after World War II, the American people were gung-ho, patriotic sacrifice, suffer for the world, and they bought into the scheme. And they let the government start doing it, and the courts took advantage of it, pushing their socialist, globalist socialist nonsense. How do all you liberals end up as federal judges? My God, you'd think that only people that cared about the law, conservatives, would end up. But no, the liberals get in to pervert it. And that's exactly what they've done. It's judicial legislation and constitutional fraud that has brought the power of the IRS to bear on the American worker. The constitutional fraud being it's not a direct, non-apportioned tax on all income, and the judicial fraud being the judicial legislation of altering the law and accepting the fraudulent claim to power under the 16th Amendment. And the case I'm talking about today, of course, is Moore et Ux v. United States. I've got an article about it on the taxfreedom.com website. It's a SCOTUS article. You should go over and read it because it exposes the fact that when the Supreme Court tells you income taxes are indirect taxes, that means it can't tax your labor. The only way to tax labor is if it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. When that goes away, there's no tax on your labor. And the Supreme Court has now said they're indirect. So claim exempt and stop filing. Don't let them collect anything to begin with, and then don't file anything. Nothing is taxable. How would rent be taxable to the federal government? Is it federal property? No, it's an estate. It's your building. Is there any interstate commerce? No. Somebody in the state rents it. Where's the territorial jurisdiction for a federal tax? It doesn't exist. What's the legislative topic for a tax? Impost? Duty? Excise? No. No, it's not there. There's no federal basis for taxing rent. It's your money. Interest, same thing. Royalties, same thing. Dividends, same thing. Compensation for services. What's the basis for the federal government taxing your compensation for services in the 50 states? Raking your neighbor's yards and getting $100 for doing it for the whole season. What's the basis for them taxing that? There isn't any. There isn't any. It's an activity conducted within the lands of the state under state law, and the federal government has no territorial or legislative prerogative to act there. That's why they need you to file. And once they dupe everyone into doing it, then they can pretend like it's a law. None of these things in Section 61 are taxable. They're all earned by right unless they're earned in a territory or possession or in a foreign country under a tax treaty. Or as a corporation. They're not taxable. Section 61 is a huge judicial fraud. It's dead letter law. The original legislation expired in 1993. Congress has never reenacted it. They don't know it's dead letter law. They didn't know it was part of a tax treaty. The judges don't know it's part of a tax treaty. It's all been fraud from within the government to deceive the people and the courts about the nature of the law. Now that the courts have been duped into it for 75 years, they can't admit it. They can't admit they've been the source of a constitutional fraud that has deprived the American people of their freedom, their homes, their lives, their wealth, their productivity, their profit. Their business. It's all been a fraud. Every single bit of it. And all of America needs to wake up and become aware of this fact that it's all been a fraud. Because that's how it ends. And probably won't end until then. Because like I said, the judges can't admit that they've been the perpetrators. It's not going to go well for them when it comes out, and they know it. They don't want to admit it. But it's true. The Supreme Court, I'm not the one telling you this. The Supreme Court is the one that said income taxes are indirect taxes. Now that kills the IRS, it kills the assessment, it kills the DOJ, and it exposes the federal courts as being the true insurrectionists in this country for the last 60 years. It's a rebellion of sedition in the courts. That's what's going on. It's got nothing to do with constitutional taxation. It's a judicial rebellion of sedition within the courts. This is Thomas Freed. We'll be back next week with more. That might have been a little early on the hop out.